Well, welcome everyone. I'm Allison Kelly Hedgepath, joined by Dr. Darren Lewis, and we are thrilled to be here with Erin DeMille, who is no stranger to our monthly webinar. So Erin, I think many of you may recognize from her prior webinars with us, is a registered dietitian with a master's in nutritional science who actively works with ongoing research projects and runs a very busy private practice and has seen many of our patients here at the Lown group. So Erin, welcome back. It's so lovely to see you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I always love to be back with the Lown gang.
So I think there's always more questions than answers in the nutritional world. So we are really excited to tackle these again and maybe get some really practical pearls from you.
Perfect. Yes. Today we'll have a practical theme. It'll be great to dive in. Awesome. Should I go ahead and share?
Yeah, let's get started.
Perfect. Can everyone see that okay? Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for the kickoff. We can get right into it. As Dr. Kelly Hedgepath just so perfectly said, nutrition usually brings up as many questions as there are answers. So today, my goal is to give us some information that's a good launch pad for even more, because there's always more when it comes to science. That's the fun part, as much as it is a handful. But what we'll do is have this launch pad for a nice place to be practical, but have an understanding of some really important concepts. Sometimes they seem simple, but there's a lot to them, which is definitely something that we'll bring up in today's conversation. But we'll be looking at foundations of an optimized diet today and what that really means in regard to your metabolic health and heart health. So first we have to look at what is an optimized diet, because that's a big undertaking. You know, we have to think of different components of our nutrition, like the energy or how much nutrition is in the food itself, how many calories, what does our body need, how much are we moving, what point in our lifespan are we? What type of chapter are we in with stress? Where's our food coming from? So it actually brings up an awful lot in a fun way, but it's a lot. So I have put together these bullet points about kind of hoping to encapsulate what an optimized diet is in terms of our metabolic health, and what would an optimized diet be in a very broad sense, but a specific sense that we know and we have evidence as to what are dietary foundations that improve lifespan and also health span. So I love thinking of lifespan where we think of the length of life, but health span where we kind of actually think of the width of life, the quality of life. And when we look at our nutrition specifically, even outside of exercise, but nutrition itself, the food itself, I would argue that we can look at evidence and glean from it that an optimized diet is going to be nutritionally dense. So it's providing all the macronutrients and micronutrients. We can't forget about those, like our vitamins and minerals and some other items that nourish the body at a much deeper level. You'll hear me say the words today, deep nutrition. That nutritionally dense component is going to be that deep nutrition for our body, where we're not just getting energy, we're getting also information. We're getting molecules that we need. We're getting fueled and optimized, not just getting by. So I like to think of deep nutrition in that regard, and that's where our nutritional density matters so much. And then we want to have that be energetically appropriate for our body. So we know when it comes to our metabolic health, if we overconsume how much energy we need for our body, so there's a uniqueness there, there's a customization that's essential. If we overconsume energy, we know that that can lead to energy toxicity, which is where we will deposit excessive storage tissue. So we will store energy in fat cells, and we can even store fat in muscle cells. So we'll see fatty muscle if we have energy toxicity, and that is related to a lot of metabolic diseases. So we want to watch our energy density. We also don't want not enough energy for our body, because that is not helpful either, because we want to have enough fuel on board and meaningful fuel. So meaningful energy where we can really optimize not only our function, but even be building tissue. So we want to optimize exercise, and we want to optimize muscle growth, and we want to have a resilient metabolism that's as broad and powerful as possible. So eating too little is also definitely not the goal. Sometimes in nutrition, I think that it gets suggested that it's best to find ways to eat as little as possible. And people are often surprised that that's actually not my goal with people. So we want to be energetically appropriate for our needs, how much our body's moving, and what our goals are. Then, of course, we need that nutrition to fuel muscle growth. And I also put in the words muscle maintenance. So we want to make sure we're eating the right nutrients that preserve muscle and take care of it and would help us not lose it. But we also want to eat the right fuel so that we could build more muscle. And we know that as we age and in different chapters of life, we need more protein and certain types of fuel to protect that muscle. And we need even more to preserve that muscle and to build muscle. So building goes beyond preservation. So that's when we kick it up a notch. So we want to keep that in mind too. And then an optimized diet will also be supplying nutrients that are essential to life, but also, I like this bullet point, supplying beneficial nutrients that optimize life. So I like to think of there's a kind of a difference in our nutrition of just getting by, enough to survive, kind of making it, squeaking through, and being optimized and thriving. Those are two very different things. A lot of people's nutrition has them more in the bucket of just getting by, and they're not feeling awesome. Their physiology is not optimized. Their mood and their cognition might not even be optimized. So I really like to think of optimization for that reason. So we can use nutrients to optimize life. We also want to nourish the microbiome. And I say that because we're not going to get deep into that today, but I'm going to skim on that a couple times, just because we know that that would undoubtedly be a part of an optimized diet. So we wouldn't ignore the microbiome when we're looking at true optimization. So I'll quickly define that term. If you're not familiar, the microbiome is the collection of bacterial and microbial species, so little microbes of all kinds, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, yeasts, and fungi that live in our GI tract. They live predominantly in the colon. And we know from some really beautiful bodies of research now that a well-fed microbiome, it's fed with certain types of fuel, which we'll talk about a little bit today. A well-fed microbiome is more diverse and it's more rich. So we have a very rich ecosystem in there. And that is strongly correlated with reduced inflammation and improved systemic health. So I had to have it on this list. I would have been remiss to not include that. But I also would say, beyond all these awesome physiology and biochemical markers, an optimized diet would be enjoyable. It should be fun. It should be peaceful, and it should be sustainable, which is why we don't love to see us, as many people struggle with when it comes to nutrition. We don't really want to be jumping off and on diets all the time, struggling with them, having that tense relationship with food, starting and stopping. We know that that's not very healthy. And that's certainly not optimized, right? We don't want to psychologically struggle, but be nutritionally optimized, because that's still going to harm our health. And we don't want to be psychologically like, oh, whatever, and then nutritionally depleted. That's going to harm our health. We want this nice balance, right? So we need this nice relationship with this type of optimized diet so that we can do it for life. And I always tell my clients, if I could make some bumper stickers, there's a few that I would make. One of them would be, it's better to be consistently good than occasionally great when it comes to our nutrition. So I would argue that an optimized diet actually doesn't mean perfection, but it means that we're doing it all the time, most of the time. So I'm doing it all the time, most of the time. So maybe 90% of the time, 80% of the time, but for life. That's very powerful, because food is slow. Food isn't really, oh, I had one good day a year and it helped my health. And we always say good day in nutrition. We want to have nourishing days most of the time. So it's better to be consistently good than occasionally great. And then the other thing that I often say to my clients, this could be another one of my bumper stickers, is I want to create food habits in your life that you can do on your best day, when all your ducks are in a row, the schedule is organized and you have time, but we also need to be able to do it on our worst day. And that is important too, because that is one of the things that is so difficult in our nutrition typically. I might have an optimized diet for a little while, and then I go on vacation or the holidays arrive or something stressful happens and all heck breaks loose and my optimization is gone for perhaps another year. So just keep that in mind too, that we want this gentle, slow build so that that relationship is nourishing for life. And then, so that means I'm thinking about what's optimized. So let's think a little bit about what we're typically seeing. The problems make a lot of sense in this context, and then we're going to talk about how to do some things. So we've just defined what an optimized diet might be, but let's look at what we're seeing in the US most of the time. So the majority of the top 10 causes of mortality in the US are nutrition and lifestyle related conditions, which is important for us to think about because that means that we have these risk factors that are increasing over our lifespan that are nutritionally related. And that's very different than being optimized. That's where that juxtaposing being optimized versus what the standard American diet is so important. What could I achieve if and how would I feel if I got my diet a little bit more optimized? So that's so important because in the US, this is a place where we suffer. This is a place where most of the population is suffering, and not only psychologically and emotionally, but physically. And when we see that the majority of the top 10 causes of mortality in the US are lifestyle related, I think that it sounds scary, but I think it's also an opportunity because we're seeing a strong pattern, and a strong pattern is an invitation to explore. Something is calling to us that it needs our attention when we see a pattern over and over and over again in our own lives, but certainly with the population at large. Then really importantly, over 40% of Americans report eating weekly or daily for emotional or stress-related reasons. So we know that food consumption of hyper palatable foods, so really yummy foods that are nutritionally low but calorically high, are usually consumed for a lot of emotional reasons and stress-related reasons. I just have to include that bullet point in here because while food relationships are not the theme of today's talk, it's always good to keep in mind that behavior and emotion is going to be a big part of your nutrition, and that's really normal. So I think it's important to bring that to our attention so that we know we might have something to explore there, depending on what we're noticing in our food life. Over 2/3 of US adults are at increased metabolic risk due to their nutrition status. So when we track our metabolic health here in the US and we look at how we're feeling and how we're doing and what our data is on our metabolic risk factors, like obesity, we do see that we're now over the two-thirds mark of the population. Adolescents and children are also increasing in that risk pool. But as far as adults are concerned, over 2/3 of US adults are at increased metabolic risk due to these nutrition related concerns. And then less than 4% of Americans consistently meet the recommended 150 minutes per week of exercise. So a very small amount actually exercise the amount that we're supposed to. So what does this tell me? This isn't to be doom and gloom. We're not going to hang out on this slide for long, but we need to just say, here's what an optimized diet is. Here's what a lot of us are getting. So that helps me identify the gap, right? So I'm looking at where are we suffering? Where are we struggling? And that helps me understand what does the prescription need to be? How can we help? How can we help ourselves? How can we help our population? And that's where we compare that data, so our population data, with data from around the globe. Is everybody else doing this way? How are we doing out there in the world? And that's where we have a beautiful area of research that has zoomed in nutrition on the Mediterranean diet. And when I say diet, I want to be clear, we're really meaning pattern. The Mediterranean dietary pattern, which isn't meaning a meal plan that lasts 14 days. This is a lifestyle. The word diet actually comes from the Latin word dieta, which means way of life. So when we think of diet in this setting, I don't want you to think of a short-term meal plan. I invite you to think of it as a long-term lifestyle. And then we can look at data of Mediterranean diet eaters, people who live this way. This is the way their diet is most of the time. And we look at how they're doing. And this group consistently performs some of the best in the globe. So the Mediterranean diet is consistently found to be one of the healthiest dietary patterns in the world. Year after year after year, they're kind of outperforming everybody else. There's some close seconds, and it's interesting. We won't talk about them today, but there's parts of the Pacific Rim and some regions closer to the equator where there's some similarities. There's a lot of overlap, but we're focusing on the Mediterranean diet today because it is the winner year after year for maybe 20 years now, that it continues to be found to have the lowest incidence of disease and risk. So we really love this research in nutrition. And the Mediterranean diet is found to be the best, so superior at helping reduce risks for chronic diseases. That's one of the ways that the Mediterranean diet has been found to be so potent in the way that it reduces risk, particularly cardiovascular disease and some of those related conditions. Regions of the globe that score the highest in Mediterranean diet patterns have longer lifespan and lower incidence of metabolic disease. So that's our data on those folks and bodies that receive that lifestyle. So then we have to zoom in and say, well, what is going on there? That's such an invitation to explore when we see such powerful data coming from those communities. And when we've dove in nutrition research, here's what we find. So the principles of this Mediterranean dietary pattern are very consistent, even when you're in different parts of the Mediterranean, but they have themes across them. And those are that the diet is extremely high in whole, fresh, minimally processed foods. So there's a lot of cooking at home with whole foods ingredients. They also have particularly high intakes of plants, AKA fiber, which we'll talk about more in a sec. And those are really going to be our fruits and vegetables. This is the majority of the diet. And then they have also much higher amounts than in the US actually of healthy fat consumption. So they eat olives and olive oil and nuts and seed related products. And in much higher amounts here in the US, especially in the US, for a long time, we had an anti-fat movement where we did low-fat everything. And when the original Mediterranean diet research emerged, it was really high fat in comparison to the US at the time. And a lot of nutrition researchers were scratching their heads saying, how is this region eating this much fat and living so long and having lower incidence of disease? And thankfully, we've parsed it out and learned a lot more about these different types of fats, but these nourishing, healthy fats that they eat in this region, these monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats that are from whole food sources. So olives, notice whole food, nuts and seeds, whole food. These have anti-inflammatory properties and other really beneficial properties, which we'll talk about. And they behave very differently chemically than industrial fats like margarine and butter and other things like that we might use here in the US. They also have a diet high in legumes and then whole grains. So more whole wheat flour when a grain is consumed, lots of beans and pulses and legumes and sweet potato and things of that nature. So their starches are extremely high fiber. So we're seeing less kind of white flour, white sugar, things like that. So sweets are really occasional. And in the US, that's where a majority of our carbohydrates come from, those refined carbohydrates. So there's a big difference there. They also have a diet that's rich in low-fat dairy and then lean protein. So lots of seafood, eggs, dairy products, poultry, things like that. So they get a nice dose of protein from those really nourishing sources. Importantly, and I have to put this in here because I just couldn't be a good clinician if I left it out. And a big part of the diet is that there's actually a high level of activity used to acquire and prepare the foods. So when we study the diet, we also find consistently in research that one of the components of the diet is moving a lot to get the food. So walking to the market or the garden or the farm, and then being upright and cooking and things like that. There's just effort being expended into making the food, and that is more movement, which equals more energy spent. And in some of our nutrition studies, we found that this is a really big factor. They're just more active, even especially in some of the regions when we've had some more focused studies in certain areas of Italy or France and Greece. We see them, literally farming and walking up and down hills and doing all these things. And that's undoubtedly playing a role in some of the benefits of the diet itself, is the lifestyle. So for those of us here in the US, we can certainly plant a garden, and I encourage it. That's a big part of my life that I enjoy, and a lot of my clients have taken that up as well. But we can keep in mind that high levels of movement here really help as well. So we might not have a farm, but we can schedule exercise and make sure we're walking a lot and lifting weights and doing things like that. But had to mention that. And then, so when we look at the purpose, so I know my principles of the Mediterranean diet with these whole foods, all this healthy stuff, these plant foods, these healthy fats and protein, but why? Why is that helping? And sometimes the why can be really motivating, so that we understand what we should bring into our diet and why it matters to us in our well-being, so that we can be optimized, that word that we have a focus on today. So the purpose is that we see fiber coming from these fruits and vegetables. Fiber is the structure of the plant itself. So fiber is indigestible to human beings. So it remains intact and passes through the small intestine and goes into the large intestine intact. So here's a way to think of it. Imagine celery. If you were to snap a big stick of celery in half, you'd see some of those little strings coming off the end. That's fiber. And we don't break down fiber, but our bacterial friends in the gut break down fiber. So when we eat fiber, we fuel our gut health, because all of our bacterial friends can consume it. And when we feed them, they get healthier. So we see high fiber doses in the Mediterranean diet. And then when we see the benefits of that, it makes sense why this diet is so nourishing. We fuel the microbiome, which is associated with total body improved health and reduced inflammation in the entire body. But also fiber digests really slowly. It moves through our GI tract very slowly, which helps us feel nice and full. And that helps regulate our appetite hormones. And these are hormones that help us properly feel hunger and fullness. And it also helps regulate those post-meal hormones, like our blood sugar related activity and things like that. So when we digest slower, we have a slower trickle of carbohydrates into the bloodstream. We feel nice and full. We balance our hormones, and we fuel the gut. That's like a quadruple whammy. It's not even a double whammy. So there's a lot of nourishment there at kind of every level as fiber moves through us. But then we see these healthy protein doses in the Mediterranean diet. And we know that lean proteins, lean, healthy, whole food proteins regulate our hormones and our blood sugar. And as I mentioned, proteins specifically protect and preserve and fuel muscle. And we need that so much at all chapters of life, but especially we need to preserve that muscle and even try to grow more as we age. And that is where we see a lot of the setting of metabolic disease begin. And these lean, high protein diets have been shown consistently to reduce some of those risk factors that we see metabolically. So when we eat adequate protein, we're balancing hormones, we're balancing blood sugar. That makes us feel really good too. It makes us feel nice and full, and we're helping our muscle out, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And then, as I mentioned, those healthy fats from the olives and the olive oil and the nuts and seeds help provide material for anti-inflammatory cascades. That sounds like a mouthful. Anti-inflammatory cascades. All you need to know that means is it's the opposite of inflammatory cascades. So when I eat healthy fats, they send my biochemistry down a pathway that reduces inflammation. When I eat less healthy fats, I can send my body down a pathway where I increase inflammation. So one of the powerful things of the Mediterranean diet is its anti-inflammatory components. So just remember that those healthy fats have that anti-inflammatory property to them that can be so helpful in reducing risk of some of those metabolic disease concerns. And we'll talk more about that as well. These healthy fats are also great for energy and fueling cellular activity. They're also very good for cognitive health, which we now is seeing kind of in a lot of research that's folding into and seems to be related to our metabolic health quite a bit. So those healthy fats also are doing a lot neurologically, which we love that too, right? We want a young brain. So we know that those healthy fats are so helpful there. So just another great thing to keep in mind. And then lastly, we know that the Mediterranean diet with all these beautiful plant foods is really high in phytonutrients, so special types of compounds that come from plants, as well as vitamins and minerals that serve the body at that deep nutrition level. And we're going to talk more about that, but that is that, remember, deep nutrition is that deeper level of nutrition where things are optimized. They're not just getting by. And I like to think of our nutrition in that sense, especially. So these are some of the powerful components of the Mediterranean diet that I just went over. We don't have to go through the diagram, but I thought it was a nice way of pointing out some of the relationships here. Feel free to take a picture if it's helpful. But what is this pattern of nutrition doing for people? The high mineral, vitamin, and phytonutrient intake includes these powerful compounds that we're finding are so helpful for improving our metabolic health. And these include things like polyphenols, which we find in a lot of our fruits and vegetables, which is a special kind of anti-inflammatory phytonutrient. Lycopene is another wonderful phytonutrient that we're finding in a lot of our fruits and vegetables. And then great minerals like magnesium and potassium, and then really important compounds like antioxidants. So that high fiber component of the Mediterranean diet is powerful biochemically. I know it can get a little boring to hear someone say, oh, eat your fiber. So I want to be clear. It's actually pretty complicated, the ways that this beautiful plant fuel does so much for our body. And it's very literal. There's these beautiful biochemical pathways where we see these different components of the plants doing different things to our bodies. So when we say fiber, we really mean so much more than just eat a plant. There's a lot in there, and there's a lot of reasons for it. It's the fiber itself, it's the phytonutrients, it's the vitamins and minerals. There's just a beautiful synergy of events there where we're getting benefited at many different levels. We also, as I mentioned, a key takeaway of that Mediterranean pattern is going to be those anti-inflammatory fats. And specifically, one of the groups of those that I'd love for you to just know, just so you can keep an eye on it in your diet, is the omega-3 fatty acids. So just a great thing to know. Keep an eye on it. It is particularly anti-inflammatory, and it comes from fatty wild seafood and flaxseed and some algae supplements if you can't eat seafood. And we'll talk more about that. But that's going to be a really big one for creating the anti-inflammatory cascade. And then, as I mentioned, the lean protein and high fiber helps us build and maintain lean mass. It helps us have easily maintain a healthy body weight. So, you know, if we're hungry because we haven't eaten enough protein, it's going to be harder to be energetically balanced. That's going to prove to be difficult to maintain a healthy body weight. We'll talk more about that in a sec. And remember, protein helps balance hormones. So what does this look like? What is this beautiful Mediterranean pattern? You're learning about all the components, but if we look at it on a plate, I love to have a good visual. This is practical. You can do this at your next meal. And I just love to think of food sometimes in this way as well. We love the biochemistry, but we also want to know what the heck to eat, right? So I love to keep it simple and think of the Mediterranean plate essentially mostly in this wheelhouse. So obviously there can be some little differences here and there, but it's kind of in this family most of the time, which is half of the plate is vegetables. A quarter of the plate is lean, nourishing protein at least. And then a quarter of the plate is these high fiber, nutritionally valuable starches like beans and whole grains and things like that. Then we could have a small serving of fruit like figs or strawberries or some citrus. Water, certainly always with the meal. And then for roasting and seasoning and dressing, we see about 1 to 3 tablespoons. So I say about 2 tablespoons of healthy fats. And that's going to be those beautiful things like nuts, seeds, olives, or olive oil. And that's essentially what that Mediterranean plate is often looking like. So that's just like a nice way to have a little visual aid for what should I make dinner look like tonight? Something in this wheelhouse will definitely do the trick. So let's talk about each food group and ideas for getting it into your diet, and then some food lists for each one. So when we're optimizing carbs and making them more Mediterranean diet in nature, we're making them Mediterranean in nature, we're looking for a few things. One is, remember, carbohydrates can be in the diet. I know sometimes we get fearful of, can I even eat carbs? Because, depending on the week, carbs are going to kill us or carbs are great for us. But remember, all of the food groups are big families, and there's some in each family that can be really nourishing, and there's some in each family that maybe are not as helpful. So we're focused on, in the Mediterranean diet, the super nourishing carbohydrates, and these are the ones that we want to make our diet rich in. So carbohydrates actually fuel muscle growth as well as protein. So carbs help fuel muscle growth. So we want to make sure we're eating smart, nourishing carbs to help our muscle out. It's great fuel for exercise. One question I get asked a lot, so I wanted to address it, was if we need additional fuel for exercise. So I will talk about this with protein, but we'll also talk about this with carbs. One of my rules of thumb is that if you are an adult who's exercising for less than 90 minutes per day, and you're able to eat 3 nourishing meals, the research shows us that we don't really need additional fuel. Our body can handle that quite well, as long as those 3 meals are nutritionally very dense. Once exercise starts getting longer, and we're really over that hour mark, we're getting into, 70, 80, 90 minutes. If you're running or biking or something like that for 120 minutes, that's when we start needing additional fuel for exercise. That's also definitely somewhere where we would want to be making sure we're seeing a professional, maybe got a few performance nutrition tips. But if we are a healthy adult that's able to eat 3 nourishing meals a day, and we exercise for, say, an hour a day, maybe 30 to 60 minutes, we shouldn't need additional fuel for that workout. Our healthy meals should take care of that quite well, but we want those to be healthy meals. So I don't want you to go exercise for 60 minutes and eat a bowl of popcorn. I want you to exercise, and then get a really nourishing lunch in afterwards so that you get really well fueled and replenished. So remember too, these smart carbs and these really high fiber healthy carbs are going to be substrate for the microbiome. So we're feeding your gut health with these two, and they're essential for recovery, sleep, and muscle repair. So the way to implement these in the diet is, I want to make sure we talk about this bullet point mostly. These are my words for you today for when it comes to carbs. I love to think of carbs not as good and bad, because I don't want to feel restricted and stressed around them. I would offer you instead this idea, and this is something I talk about a lot with my clients. I think of carbs and other foods as either easy to regulate or hard to regulate. So when I call something a hard to regulate carbohydrate, I'm talking about something like Ben & Jerry's. Delicious, but not filling. My appetite hormones do not know when I've had enough, because the Ben & Jerry's is so rewarding and pleasureful, and it's so low in fiber and protein that it will not trigger my appetite regulatory hormones. So it's kind of sneaky food where I'm eating a lot of calories, but no nutrition. That is what we call hard to regulate. My biology and my biochemistry doesn't know how to talk to that food. An easy to regulate carb would be a bowl of broccoli, a really big salad, a bowl of blueberries. If you have beans, with your protein, you're going to get full. Your stomach is going to stretch. All that fiber is going to let your body know that you've eaten enough and you've gotten nice and full. And it's going to help you slowly digest, so that you get a slow trickle of carbohydrates into the bloodstream, so you don't get cravings and blood sugar spikes or crashes. And it's going to help trigger the release of those fullness hormones. So biochemically, your body knows how to talk to that food. That's where those whole foods come in the Mediterranean diet. So instead of thinking, oh man, I got to cut my carbs, it could be really helpful for a lot of people to more so think about, I want to add in to my diet more easy to regulate carbs. And maybe I occasionally have some hard to regulate carbs when I get an occasional ice cream cone in the summer, but I might not want those hard to regulate carbs in my daily diet. That's what we tend to see in the US. We have those hard to regulate carbs in the standard American diet. They're very easy to consistently overeat. They're very hard to stop eating, and they're very pleasurable and rewarding. I also like to point this out because people always say to me, Erin, I don't know what's wrong with me. I cannot have one French fry. I cannot have one potato chip. I can't just have a little, ice cream or a few M&Ms. I could eat the whole thing. And I tell people, yes, that totally makes sense because biochemically, that's how those work. So think of carbs in that family, and your Mediterranean diet carbs are going to be these easy to regulate carbs. So the higher the fiber content, the slower the digestion. And then also to I would throw out there, just keep an eye on variety, color, and diversity of your carbohydrate sources. So if you have beans and sweet potato and asparagus and apples and blueberries, there's a lot of diversity there, and there's a lot of benefit from that diversity. So this is our more, some, less of the food groups. When it comes to the Mediterranean diet, here's what we see. We see eat more of these. So these are food lists that I want you to be able to use today. So we want more vegetables, fruits, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, quinoa, wild rice, bulgur, farro, oats, beans, and legumes. These are high fiber, highly nutritionally dense carbs. And then we see some, but not a lot in the Mediterranean diet. So we want to eat some, but not much. We could see a little corn, a little white rice, maybe a little cereals or granolas, but we don't want a lot of those. And then we want less when it comes to sugars, soda, sweetened beverages, any sugar sweetened beverages like red can Coke, things like that. We really want to keep an eye on that. Juices, candies, fast food, pretzels, cereal bars, and packaged snacks. We don't see a lot of those in the Mediterranean diet. So more, some, less. It's okay if one of those pops in really occasionally. It's okay if we see a little bit of this here and there, but we really want to see a lot of this mostly when we're making those carbohydrate decisions. Okay, now let's talk about protein. On to our next macronutrient. So this is very helpful. It is the most satiating macronutrient. And what that word means is filling. Satiation is the chemical act of getting full from our meal. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So some of my clients joke with me, and once they optimize their diet, they feel so different. And they say to me, Erin, looking back, I realized I was a carbitarian. I was eating cereal for breakfast, a sandwich with almost no protein for lunch, pretzels for snacks, pasta and pizza and things like that, and rice and takeout for dinner. And I was always hungry. And that's because they were not getting adequate protein. Especially here in the US, a lot of our meals are centered around refined carbs, and the meal is low in protein in general. And especially in the US, we do that a lot at breakfast. So the day begins with not feeling satiated, not triggering those fullness hormones, and then not balancing our blood sugar and hormones either. So that sets us up for some trouble for the rest of the day. And there's some interesting research on that. We're just going to have cravings and more hunger and things like that that are really tricky to work through. So it's very, very helpful to get a good, complete protein serving at breakfast because of this satiation effect. We get nice and full. It triggers all of our fullness and regulatory appetite hormones. It balances our blood sugar. And of course, these great protein sources are essential for muscle growth, muscle repair after workout, and muscle recovery, and muscle preservation. So we really need adequate protein, and we need even more protein as we age. Also, too, the more you exercise, the more you need. So I know a lot of our awesome doctors recommend to us that we should be weightlifting and exercising several times a week, but at least weightlifting 2 to 3 times a week. We hear that a lot. When we're doing that, we need to make sure that our meal after training has protein in it so we can fuel that muscle growth. Proteins are made of amino acids, which I tell my clients to think of it as like little Legos that all snap together. Some of those little Legos, some of those little amino acids actually trigger muscle protein synthesis. So if they're not there, we can't really start that process chemically. So we want to have a good, complete protein, especially after we're training. So if you've added exercise and weightlifting into your day or your week, make sure you keep an eye on that. We also can add some more protein if we're aiming for a little bit more leanness. So if we're trying to add muscle or lose fat, we want to make sure we increase our protein a little further. When we look at research on promoting and preserving lean mass and settling into a nice healthy body weight for our body, we see this range of protein tend to be the most beneficial in our studies. And this range is 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of protein per day of desired body weight. Woo, kind of a mouthful. But what does that mean? If I'm 150 pounds, and I want to stay 150 pounds, I could just say 150 times 0.7, or I can say 150 times 1, which is 150. So that means I need 150 grams of protein per day. So we want to make sure we look at that range for our body. So you can do a little math there to make sure you know your number of a range that you might do really nicely with. And that's especially important for aging and being active. So make sure your number is in that wheelhouse. An easy way to break this down is to think of protein per meal. And actually tracking protein more so than the other nutrients is a little easier. It's actually usually pretty easy to just get quickly on the nutrition label how many grams of protein something has, or you can look it up online, how much protein is in 4 ounces of chicken breast. It's usually easy to find that. And then you just have to look it up once and then you'll know it forever. But I love to have my clients, especially if they haven't been eating a lot of protein at all, to start with 25 grams per meal so they can start practicing. And for a lot of people, that feels like a lot because it's so new to them. Then they might graduate to 30, and then we might get them to 40. And then they're always in that range of about 25 to 40 grams of protein per meal. And that can make a profound difference on their fullness and their hormone balancing. We also get bonus points for pairing protein with fiber and fat. So remember that Mediterranean plate, we saw half the plate is vegetables, a quarter of the plate was that high fiber starch. So there's all our beautiful carbs. And then we have that complete protein serving, maybe about 4 to 6 ounces. And then we have our healthy fats on top. So what do I have? I have fiber, protein, and fat. That's a beautiful combination for meeting Mediterranean diet goals, but it's also just in general wonderful for promoting muscle and protecting muscle, balancing hormones, and feeling nice and full. So we'll feel very different. Even cognitively, we will feel different if we start our day with cereal, which is basically just carbs, maybe a little fat from the milk, and then versus egg whites and pesto and vegetables. We'll feel really different with that second meal. We'll feel full, we'll feel energized. We should feel really empowered and comfortable for hours after that meal. So it's also fun to experiment with this, and you'll notice some differences in your body. And we do want a protein serving about 90 minutes after we train. So I say kind of 1 to 2 hours usually is ideal. That's a good place to have a little protein snack if you can't eat for a few hours after you train, if you lift weights. But if you're going to have lunch within an hour or 2 or so after you work out, just make sure you have a good complete protein serving at that meal. And we do see, I'll lastly just touch on this quickly, carbs and fat, it's kind of flexible in some ways where we put those throughout the day. Protein, however, has been found to be most beneficial when we have these protein, I call them pulses. This is sometimes the word used in the research, where we pulse protein periodically throughout the day. So I have a serving at breakfast, a serving at lunch, maybe a small serving at my snack, a serving at dinner. Protein seems to be most beneficial when we do that with that nutrient. So just something to keep an eye on, where it might not be very beneficial to have very little protein all day and then a bunch at dinner, say, for example. Whereas, if something happens with our fiber, our vegetables, and we can still get in all our veggies at dinner, that's not too bad of a thing. Certainly, there's some flexibility there, but protein seems to be really optimized when we space it out and get those pulses throughout the day. So this is a nice list of protein sources. So I love thinking about more, some, less with these as well. In the Mediterranean diet, and in all of our favorable nutrition research, we see that we want more of lean proteins like chicken and turkey, loads of seafood, kind of all kinds, scallops and sardines and anchovies and wonderful things like that are fabulous, and white fish like halibut and cod. We also get tons of benefits from salmon and fatty wild fish. A little tuna can be very, very wonderful. Tofu, eggs, Greek yogurt, wild game, cottage cheese, all of those prove to be really, really wonderful, complete proteins that serve that protein goal that we just talked about on the last slide. Then we can use some of these. So these are not off limits, but we can figure out, where we need them in our diet. Some of us do need like a protein shake every day if we're weightlifting, and we get a good quality protein powder. Something like that can be very frequent in the diet. We just want to make sure it's a really good one. And then we can totally occasionally have some lean beef, or very occasionally some medium lean meats. There's also some plant proteins that can help us reach our goals. If we're having trouble getting enough protein on a vegetarian diet, we could add in a little seitan or tempeh. And then we would say less when it comes to more processed proteins. So things like protein bars or non-organic and non-nitrate free deli meats, we really want to avoid those. The nitrates in deli meats have been shown in research to be a little bit of a health hazard, so we want to reduce that. Sausages or highly processed fatty meat sausages like that, we want to have less of those, and less high fat meats, or the plant-based fake meats are usually really low in protein, and they're actually usually predominantly corn or soy fats. It's like just like a soybean oil, and a lot of them have thickeners and sugars added to them as well. They're just very, very processed. So if we're working on getting plant-based proteins into our diet, we'd want to go more towards things like tofu than the plant-based meat alternatives. And then our last macronutrient is our beautiful friend fats. And this is a big family of nutrients, so we won't go too far down the rabbit hole. But this is interesting because remember I said protein is the macronutrient with the most satiation. So it makes you the fullest. Fats help you stay full. And this word satiety that I'm highlighting there with my pointer, that is different than satiation. So satiation is the appetite effect of I'm full now. So I'm in the moment, I just finished my lunch, I'm full. Satiety is the appetite component where I'm staying full. And fats provide the most satiety. So that's why it's so beautiful to say, to pair protein, fiber, and fat. Protein and fiber fuel me and help me get nice and full in the meal. Fats nourish me as well and help me stay nice and full. So that's a really good combination. There's also some essential fats like the omega-3s that I mentioned that are necessary for brain and cellular function, and they only come from the diet. So our body can't make omega-3s, we must consume them. And those beautiful omega-3s are the fats that trigger anti-inflammatory pathways. And we love that. We love that so much. I will say one of the hardest parts of fats is that when we eat outside of the home or we eat processed food, we lose a lot of control over the type of fats used. So in the US, a lot of our processed food and restaurant foods use soybean oil or partially hydrogenated oils and fry oils that get oxidized at really high heat. These are known inflammatory fats. So they're not these awesome anti-inflammatory fats. So preparing food at home, like they do in the Mediterranean pattern, makes getting these healthy fats in a lot easier because we can cook with olive oil and avocado oil and things like that. And we know what the fat is when we're cooking. So it's a little easier to manage these at home. And these whole food sources are the easiest to regulate. You know, it's going to be very different if we have Crisco versus olives. So with that idea of hard to regulate versus easy to regulate, we want these whole foods. And again, they'll help us. It's so synergistic. I probably sound like a broken record, but it helps us balance our blood sugar and then regulate our appetite hormones. So it's very synergistic. So how we see this in the Mediterranean pattern is we see about 1 to 3 tablespoons of these healthy fats per meal. We need to adjust that according to our needs and goals. So our bodies are all going to have different energy needs depending on our size, age, and activity levels and things like that. But about, 1 to 3 tablespoons is often the realm of the Mediterranean pattern. The other thing I like to mention, I get asked this all the time, if you are working out and you're noticing you have an upset stomach in your workout, one thing you can do is not have fats before your workout. So say you work out at 8 a.m. and you eat breakfast at 7 a.m. You might notice that if you do not have fat at that 7 a.m. breakfast, that you feel more comfortable in your workout. But what you do need to do is just make sure you have your healthy fats at the meal after your workout. So the reason for this is actually, it's a double-edged sword. Fats slow digestion. They trigger a chemical to get released that slows digestion once they're in our GI tract. They trigger the release of this chemical that slows everything down. That is awesome for feeling full and staying full. That is not good if we have food sloshing around in our GI tract when we're trying to run or lift weights. So if you notice, I just actually had a client who was eating Kind bars first thing in the morning and then going to her workout, and she wasn't feeling nice and full from the meal because it didn't have any protein in it. And she was having GI distress in her workouts because the Kind bars, some of them have a lot of sugar in them, but a lot of them also are mostly fat. It's just almonds and seeds and peanuts and things like that. So it's really high fat. And she had a very upset stomach in her training. So once she had lean protein with a little bit of fruit before her workout, her GI issues went away. She was very comfortable in her workout. She was nice and full. So just make sure you get those fats later in the day. Okay. So just, you can keep those out about 1 to 2 hours before your workout if you notice you're having GI distress. The other thing is, remember, we can optimize these anti-inflammatory fats by selecting whole foods. So look for those whole food source fats like olives, olive oil, and avocados or nuts and seeds. And remember from a few slides ago, I mentioned with carbohydrates, there's easy to regulate carbs and hard to regulate carbs. Ben & Jerry's is my example of a hard to regulate carb. But it's also hardest, there's really neat research on this. It's hardest to regulate a food when it's a fat mixed with sugar. And that's what Ben & Jerry's is. So it's heavy cream, right? So loads of fat with lots of sugar poured in. So sweets and pastries and snack items and desserts and things like that, croissant or donut, or a lot of the modern, muffins that we might see at Dunkin' Donuts and things like that. The fat, the grams of fat per meal and the grams of sugar per meal are just so high. And that is what makes calories really high. But that's what makes those foods very pleasureful to our brain and very sneaky. They kind of sneak past our hormones, so we can't stop eating them. We don't get full. So just remember, fats plus sugar equals harder to regulate. And we just might not want to have those harder to regulate foods in our daily life. We can have them occasionally, but just know, when I'm having one of those treats, you can just be conscientious about it of, this isn't going to make me feel very full. So I might be smart about my serving size. And I know that this food is rewarding and it's easy to keep eating. So I'm just going to enjoy that with a lot of intentionality, knowing that that's how that food works and doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. And these are the awesome fat sources that we want to think about. So more olive oil, avocado oil, all these beautiful fats, nuts, seeds, nut butters, olives, some coconut, egg yolks, walnut oil, and then dressings or marinades with any of those oils. We want some of, peanuts, a little expeller pressed canola oil, organic cheese, a little organic butter, something like that. Occasionally is okay. And then we want less of these kind of fry oils, hydrogenated oils, fried foods, shortenings, processed foods, or dressings or marinades made with those less nutritious oils. And this is just, so in case anyone didn't believe me, feel free to take a picture. This is just a cool little schematic of the way we get an anti-inflammatory effect from different foods and the different fats that these different foods allow our body to make. So when I eat these lean proteins and healthy fats, I can make these beautiful omega-3s that then create that anti-inflammatory cascade, which eventually results in the formation of these molecules here. Just kind of cool. And then lastly, we're just going to touch on there's micronutrients in these foods that matter so much in the Mediterranean diet when we look at the powerful ways that the Mediterranean diet reduces disease risk. We see fiber and phytonutrients, as I mentioned. We want at least 25 to 30 grams per day of fiber, bare minimum. The average adult American gets about 9 grams of fiber per day. So we need to more than double our fiber efforts. And remember, inside that fiber that we're eating, it can get a little complicated, but just remember, there's phytonutrients in there and all these vitamins and minerals that are so powerful. It's not just the fiber itself, it's these beautiful little molecules that the plants hold inside of them as well. Two of those that we care a lot about are potassium and magnesium. And for heart health, I just have to mention these. So potassium is really interesting. It's in a lot of beautiful fruits and vegetables. So apricots, tomatoes, leafy greens. And we find in our nutrition research that low levels of potassium in our blood have been found to be related to the hardening of arteries, which increases risk of cardiac events. So obviously we don't want that. We don't want the hardening of our arteries. So adequate intakes of potassium and even high intake of potassium is associated with a lower risk of hardening of arteries and cardiac event. So it's awesome. So this number here, 3,000 milligrams per day, was found to be a number where we see risk reduction. So we want to make sure we get that every day. And then similarly with magnesium, we see reduced risk of some cardiac events. And also we see anti-inflammatory properties to magnesium, anti-hypertensive properties. Magnesium also seems to help us have improved carbohydrate metabolism, so glucose metabolism. Magnesium also has been shown to help us have a younger brain age, which I love that. And that study found that at least 550 milligrams per day led to a younger brain age. If we eat a Mediterranean dietary pattern, we will hit those numbers pretty easily. Sometimes we have to supplement maybe with a little magnesium, but we can get really close. So that's all to say, when you look at this Mediterranean diet, this is where all the benefits of it are coming from. It's actually in the details, all these different things that it's providing. And we get great magnesium from nuts, seeds, seafood, and fish and leafy greens. So we want to make sure we hit those levels. And then this is my last slide for us today. Well, pretty much, but I just wanted to give you a sample day. And this could be a good slide to take a picture of if you want to see what this looks like. This is a sample day where we get 1,700 calories, so kind of moderate caloric intake, not particularly high. A bigger person would need more than that, but 140 grams of protein, 32 grams of fiber, a full dose and then some of omega-3s, and we reach all of our potassium and magnesium targets. And this is just a sample day of what that looks like. So a quick scramble for breakfast with some vegetables and pesto, bed of greens with tuna and avocado oil mayo and vegetables and a piece of fruit at lunch, a Greek yogurt snack with blueberries and pecans, and then a salmon and veggie dinner with a little dark chocolate for dessert. It's a delicious day. This is a really yummy day. And this is a sample day of a Mediterranean diet. So this is something that we could do tonight, or we could do this tomorrow, and you would hit all of these awesome nutritional targets that we know lead to an optimized diet. So I love that. So feel free to take a picture if it would be helpful. And then lastly, I just always have to say to everyone, I know these nutrition workshops and all this nutrition information can feel really overwhelming, but just remember to start small, put it in lifestyle process, do a habit change process, and you can slowly build your Mediterranean lifestyle. And that's how I recommend doing it. So you don't need a 2-week meal plan, just do small habit change and string it all together. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin. That was great. We have definitely filled the hour, but I would be remiss if we didn't do just a couple of questions. Since you have your slides up still, do you want to go back to the sample? Because I do think that was just so wonderful to really see, because I do think what science is helping us understand, especially as we age, in order to preserve our muscle mass, which is so critical to our quality of life, we really have to be focusing on protein. And that's somewhere right along with those micronutrients and the fiber, as you mentioned. Unless you're really purposeful, it's easy to miss out on that. So at the risk of really being repetitive, maybe you just want to hit the highlights again of, you know, getting enough protein at each of these meals and how you think about it as you're kind of building optimal for all of us.
Absolutely. And that's exactly the hurdle. We easily don't get enough fiber and we easily don't get enough protein. So I tell my clients, I want them to have laser beams in their eyes where they look for protein first at every meal, because that's what we can kind of build the meal around in some ways. So when we approach breakfast, we need to say, okay, traditionally breakfasts are these high carbohydrate meals in our country. Where can I get a nice, lean, satiating protein source? If I do 1 cup of egg whites plus 1 egg, so I get all the nutrition of the egg, but I bump up my protein availability with the egg white, I get 40 grams of protein easily. So this is all calculated out. That's 40 grams. So, and that's that protein pulse. So we get the pulse at breakfast by getting our eggs in. And then at lunch, our 5 ounces of tuna. So that's usually a classic 1 small can. You can just use one of those, 1 whole ones of those, mashed with 1 tablespoon of avocado oil. That 5 ounces of tuna gives you 40 grams of protein with a healthy fat. And we can put that on a bed of greens and get our 40 grams there, another pulse. 8 ounces of non-fat plain Greek yogurt is a great way to, again, laser beams for the protein at snack time. This is where we see people do crackers and little, like, do a loop through the candy dish at the office type of thing. But if we're hungry, we need to be nourished. So that's a great place to look for that lean protein source. Again, 8 ounces of non-fat plain Greek is actually 25 grams of protein. From most brands, or at least close to it. And then at dinner, my 4 ounces of roasted salmon not only has all those omega-3s, but it has 40 grams of protein in it again. And then I build the meal around that beautiful salmon.
And it sounds delicious.
Yes, that's the best part of the Mediterranean pattern. It's yummy.
Then if we went and caught the fish ourselves, then we'd really be hitting all the points, right?
At that point, we're basically in Italy. Or at least in my mind, right?
So there are a lot of really good questions and some that got sent in that we unfortunately don't have time to finish with, but maybe what we can do, Erin, if it's okay with you, is send them to you after and then we can mail them out to our participants. Is that okay?
I will do a big Q&A email and answer them all. Absolutely.
Okay. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. You walked us through the macronutrients, the fats, the carbs, the proteins, the micronutrients, the potassium, magnesium. And you did all that in an hour. And this is it's inspiring. I feel I have a lot of really good ideas to make my diet and my patients' diets healthier and also still really delicious, because that is such an important piece of making this sustainable.
Yes, it's got to be yummy. Absolutely. And there's a lot to it. So I know there's so much to talk about. So I'll definitely be happy to do an email. So thank you for having me. And thank you everyone for coming.
And thank you. And maybe we can bring you back for a follow-up as well. And I want to
always.
Thanks to our audience. Our next webinar, we're taking August off for the summer. Our next webinar will be with Dr. Karen Lee on sleep in September 11th. So keep an eye out on your emails. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.